Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 21, The Long 7th Century, Part 2. Today's subject is one I've had a morbid fascination with for about as long as I can remember. There's a story from the Bible that I'll cover today, where an unnamed young girl's pious father makes an irresponsible promise to his God, and in a terrible twist ending, she implicitly ends up on the altar, killed and burned to feed the god and fulfill the oath. The author of the passage seems to have been hesitant to put the grisly details to paper, or perhaps a later editor removed them. I remember reading the story as a child and being both horrified and intrigued by the fact that there is no commentary in the passage condemning the act. How could an all-powerful God even let this happen in his name, even allowing that it's not what he wanted? There's even another, much more famous story where Yahweh literally stops Abraham's hand before he can do the same thing. So, yes, the subject of child sacrifice stirs up a lot of emotions and questions about human nature and about God himself, for those who believe. The very name Moloch, the supposed god of child sacrifice, has become shorthand for painting one's enemies in the nastiest light possible, as a person who would kill a defenseless baby, one of their own kind. I'm fully aware of anti-Semitic claims about Jews and drinking the blood of Christian babies. Ironically, while Christians would go on to smear Jews with these accusations, in the early history of Christianity, before they became the empire, they were themselves accused of horrible practices like this and all manner of debauchery. But I'm also aware of claims of the supremacy of Abrahamic faiths and the various histories of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Lots of folks use history and critical scholarship as a weapon to attack their enemies. Now, this is not a show that makes moralizing attacks on any modern faith tradition. I write from my perspective, but I am mostly uninterested in debates about cultural or moral supremacy of variant extant religions. Everyone's got baggage, everyone's apologists suck and are annoying, and while I will address some of the apologetic reflexive defenses that try to smooth over the very heavy topic we're discussing today, the main point here is to instead historically contextualize child sacrifice in both rhetoric and practice. The horrors of this very real phenomenon will be unfairly leveraged against an absurd number of people over the 2,600 years after the period we're dealing with. Child sacrifice is not a particularly unique feature of Iron Age Yahwists and Baal worshippers and other Mediterranean peoples in the ancient world, if we're being honest with ourselves. Human sacrifice in a variety of forms has been practiced throughout the world, and it's probably unlikely to find a corner of the earth where some folks, to some degree, at some point, haven't practiced some form of it. We are a bloodthirsty and violent and desperate and superstitious species, and it would be frankly surprising to not find these aspects of human behavior worm their way into our cultic practices at times. And so I'll proceed into this most difficult of topics with a careful eye on precision, while still aiming to be as direct and unflinching as you've come to expect from the Bible Lore Podcast. The main sources for this episode are Francesca Stavrakopoulou's Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, and Heath Dewrell's Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel. I highly recommend both of these books for anyone who wants to explore this topic more deeply. They both have a refreshing directness. As always, these and all other sources will be listed in the bibliography portion of the episode description. And of course, if you like the work I do here, please consider becoming a supporter at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. It's as little as $5 a month, and it really helps keep the show going. And as one last piece of housekeeping, I had to split the child sacrifice episode in two, meaning that the long 7th century miniseries will have 4 parts, at least. This part will mostly cover the idea of child sacrifice in the Bible, how it functions and where it's discussed in the Bible in a positive or at least a neutral fashion, while the next episode will discuss the reality of child sacrifice, along with later attempts to bury the practice and reckon with it. Last time, we talked about Esarhaddon, Assyria's paranoid king, forged in the fire of a disputed succession, a man who sought to avoid this crisis for his own irregular succession setup. And irregular it was. The plan was for 2 of his sons to become kings, the older in Babylon to the south, and the younger in Nineveh to the north. The younger, Ashurbanipal, would, in violation of some cultural norms, rule the majority of the empire, being the superior in the brotherly power-sharing agreement. Before he died en route to retake Egypt in 669 BCE, though, Esarhaddon enacted one last substitute king ritual, setting a young man as king in place of his elder son, Shamash-shuma-ukin, in Babylon. While typically reserved for truly disastrous omens like the total eclipse that occurred a couple years prior to the king's untimely death from illness, the superstitious king Esarhaddon instituted a handful of substitute king rituals in his short reign. The ritual would appease the anger of the gods by allowing the real king to live, sequestered away from the danger of the gods in his temporary technical demotion. The idea of substitution formed an important part of ancient Near Eastern cult and mythology, and it's a key theme of today's episode. Sacrifice and substitution are closely linked concepts. Ideas of commerce, of planting a seed and giving it up to make something grow, of general exchange, of seasons passing and needing renewal, of the sun going down and then coming up, of birth always leading to death, of mistakes and recompense. These all exist in conversation with sacrifice and substitution, which often function as a means of manipulating or ensuring the proper function of these natural cycles. And the associated mythology works as metaphors and folktales to explain especially the natural events. They're human categorizations of both natural and social phenomena, and the rituals are focused on controlling them. You sacrifice to the gods a small portion of what you've made in the hopes of continued good fortune in the future, and an exculpatory sacrifice, this functions in a way as a substitution or a payment for the gods' claim on your life for wronging them in some way. You don't have to die for getting into a fight with your neighbor and giving him a black eye in a fit of rage. The goat can. A price has been paid to make up for your mistake. The king's substitution ritual itself functions as a kind of sacrifice, as the substitute is, well, they go away. Again, these are intimately close concepts. The idea of exchange will especially take root in alchemy and be explored in a most thorough manner in Full Metal Alchemist.
Humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something in return. To obtain something of equal value must be lost. That is alchemy's first law of equivalent exchange.
But even thousands of years before alchemy, we see this concept of a price needing to be paid for death visible in ancient West Asian mythology. Perhaps the most famous Middle Eastern folklore for substitution outside of the Bible's scapegoat ritual is the tale of Ishtar's descent into the underworld, which is a close older cousin in the similar tale Inanna's descent into the underworld. The Ishtar version was from Akkad in the north of Mesopotamia, the Inanna version from Sumer in the south. Like the biblical parallels to many of these tales, everyone told their own versions for their own people. This north-south division, by the way, between Akkad and Sumer was how Assyria styled themselves and how the sons of Esarhaddon, the brother kings Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shuma-ukin, would be referred to. Ashurbanipal was the king of Akkad in Nineveh, the emperor of the Assyrian Empire, while Shamash-shuma-ukin was the king of Sumer in Babylon in the south. So as we're telling this story near the dawn of Ashurbanipal's monumental reign, we'll utilize the Akkadian version with Ishtar as our protagonist. The story goes something like this. The moon god Sin, who had been so crucial in Esarhaddon's victory over Egypt, had a daughter named Ishtar. Ishtar is a fairly close cognate with Ashura, Yahweh's wife. Ishtar, Astarte, Ashura, Inanna, Aphrodite, they're all cousins of varying closeness. Anyway, Ishtar sought to go into the underworld for reasons that aren't entirely made clear in the Akkadian version. Unlike the cool reasoning given for Enkidu's descent, where Gilgamesh and the boys accidentally fouled a curveball into the abyss, there's no real justification provided. She was just determined, as the tale emphasizes. You'll remember that Ishtar is, in one of the most famous tales of the Gilgamesh epic, the one who wants to take Gilgamesh for a husband, becoming enraged and sicking the bull of heaven on the hero and Enkidu when he rebuffs her advances. She was a god filled with envy and desire. The Sumerian version seems to indicate that she wanted to expand her rule even beyond the land of the living. But the realm of the dead is not a pleasant one, as we saw in the descriptions of suffering and malaise in the Gilgamesh epilogue, some of which quotes from this particular text. But here's a bit from Ishtar's version, where she goes, quote, "Into the house which those who enter cannot leave, on the road where traveling is one way only, to the house where those who enter are deprived of light, where dust is their food, clay their bread, they see no light, they dwell in darkness." The land of the dead is ruled by Ereshkigal, Ishtar's sister. Ishtar arrives at the gate to the underworld, and she threatens to bash the door down, like Gilgamesh did when he approached Shiduri's alehouse at the end of the world. The gatekeeper of the underworld tells Ishtar to stop pounding on the damn door so he can consult with Ereshkigal. The Queen of the Dead, however, is incensed by Ishtar coming into her sovereign territory, particularly because she notes that the underworld isn't even like a good piece of property to rule over. You have so much power over the nice overworld, and even in the heavens above, but you want my subterranean shithole too? Fuck you. But Ereshkigal tells the gatekeeper to allow her sister to follow the sacred rites of entry, which protect her realm. They aren't particularly easy to overcome. In a reverse of warriors like Gilgamesh and Marduk putting on sacred protection in their battles against divine agents, and paralleling Enkidu's refusal to take off all of his splendor when he goes down into the pit, Ishtar must strip her magical implements off to pass through each of the massive gates that separate the living from the damned, like the mined bridges of Manhattan in Escape from New York.
And remember, once you're inside, you're on your own.
Oh, you mean I can't count on you?
No.
Good.
As she goes through each of the 7 barriers, the gatekeeper takes her crown, then her rings, and then the rest of her sacred jewelry, with her majestic clothing as the last item removed. Each time, Ishtar protests, and each time, the gatekeeper emphasizes that these are the sacred rites. This is the process. Take it or leave it. Finally, she makes it into the underworld. But without her magical implements, she is immediately threatened with 60 diseases and struck down by her infuriated sister, Ereshkigal. She doesn't make it 2 steps. Death is truly an overwhelming force. The Anunnaki, the Council of Underworld Gods, pronounced judgment on Ishtar for her crossing of the sacred boundary between life and death. Not only does Ishtar fail to take the underworld from her sister, now she's stuck there, just another shade. As with the death of Baal and Akkad, the land suffers in her absence. Nobody is able to become pregnant. Their seed finds no purchase, man or animal. The world rapidly descends into a children of men type scenario, something that could spiral into a threat for even the divine if it goes on long enough. The gods create and dispatch a character named Goodlooks to the underworld, a special divine figure who has no problem passing through the gates. Goodlooks uses magical implements to revive Ishtar and fetch her, but even with his immense power, there's still one issue. The underworld requires a sacrifice, a substitute who can serve in Ishtar's place. There is no ritual that can overcome this basic equation, no divine power that can overcome this ancient version of the law of conservation of mass. It is immutable. So Ishtar is returned. She receives her magical garments and jewelry back, one by one in a reverse of the entry process, and in her place, Dumuzi, the god of crop fertility and Ishtar's first love, periodically must make his way into the underworld to serve a sentence in Ishtar's place, much like Baal's annual death and conquering of the underworld in his epic, similarly leading to seasonal crop cycles. And there, beyond the wonderful poetry and tales of divine intrigue, do we get the pretty common etiological function of the story, a tale of why we have seasonal crop cycles. It's because Dumuzi is doing time for Ishtar's mistake. Dumuzi, also known as Tammuz in Sumerian, and the weeping for his annual death and return cycle, is mentioned in the writings of one of the main characters of the next few episodes, the prophet Ezekiel. In chapter 8 of his titular book, Yahweh shows the prophet a vision of all the abominations and foreign practices that are going on throughout his kingdom, which will lead to Judah's exile. In this dream, the God leads his prophet to the temple in Jerusalem. Quote, "Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of Yahweh. Women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz." So even in the Jerusalem temple, people are weeping for Tammuz's sacrifice in an annual ritual. And yet, as we will see, Ezekiel himself provides a positive mention of Daniel, the hero of one of these kinds of cyclical death and resurrection stories, the Akkad epic. And another character in the Bible will have a shockingly similar annual weeping event celebrated in her honor, something Ezekiel presumably would have detested. These kinds of stories were incredibly common, well beyond the boundaries of even the Middle East, as Hallow and Younger mentioned. Quote, "There is an obvious similarity in basic theme to the Greek myth of Persephone, who was abducted by Hades. He periodically released her to her mother Demeter, thus causing fertility on Earth to be seasonal. But of course, there are many major differences between the Greek and the Akkadian myths. And so we can see this general motif in a variety of stories throughout the 1,000+ year chronology I've already covered on the show so far. This was a very popular type of story. Gilgamesh's underworld epilogue is a creative interpretation of Inanna and Ishtar's story. The Baal cycle describes him being swallowed and facing down death periodically, and of course the Akkad epic is a similar Ugaritic tale about crops being killed after the murder of Akkad, son of Dannel. But especially the substitution element of Ishtar's descent, the requirement of Tammuz to remain in the netherworld, is a powerful theme that finds a lot of purchase in the biblical texts. This begins early on in the Torah with one of the most infamous stories in all of the Bible, the Akedah, which means the binding. Sorry for the Hebrew pronunciation. The binding of Isaac. The story takes place late in Abraham's cycle in Genesis. Starting out named Abram, the prophet went through quite a lot before his story finally gets to the great climax, most of which is irrelevant for us today. The important part of the story for us goes like this. God promised to make Abram the father of many peoples, but this doesn't pan out. Initially unable to conceive a child with his wife, who's initially called Sarai, she offers for him to instead sleep with one of his slaves, the concubine Hagar. Hagar gives birth to a son, Ishmael, but El Shaddai appears to Abram at the age of 99, instructs him to get circumcised to honor the promise and covenant that he'd already made, and informs him that the deal is still on. Sarai is his wife, and together they will birth El's favored people. Abram laughs in disbelief, part of the repeated etiology for his son's name, Isaac or Yitzhak, which means he laughed. But he follows through on the autopenile modification surgery, and the happy couple receive their new names, Abraham and Sarah. Genesis detours into some of the stories in the Sodom and Gomorrah cycle, but finally it gets back on track, and Isaac is born in chapter 21. He's circumcised on the 8th day, and then we get a curious tale where Ishmael laughs, seemingly in an attempt to steal Isaac's birthright, causing Sarah to fly into a rage and kick Hagar and Ishmael out. Not important for today's story. Immediately after dispensing with Ishmael and Hagar, though, we arrive at the Akedah. In the immortal words of Bob Dylan.
Oh, God said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe said, man, you must be putting me on.
In Genesis, however, Abraham does not question God in the slightest, which the later author of the book of Hebrews says is a mark of his great faithfulness. The narrator notes at the start that God is testing Abraham, and then the Divine One tells him, quote, "Take, pray, your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah, and offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall say to you." Along with his servants and Isaac and wood to burn the sacrifice, Abraham sets out on his journey to offer up his own son, the one who is supposed to himself father all Abraham's many descendants. Indeed, God emphasizes that he does not consider Ishmael to even be Abraham's son. They reach the holy mountain, called Moriah, which seems related to the Hebrew word for to see. Moriah was eventually retconned into being Jerusalem by later exegetes, but where the author of Genesis imagined it to be is unknown. Abraham tells his servants to watch the donkey at the camp. He brings a torch and a cleaver. He makes Isaac carry the wood, and the two walk up the hill toward the altar. On the way, Isaac asks his father where the sheep for the sacrifice is. Abraham reassures him that his God will literally see to the sheep. A lot of playing on sight motifs in this story. They reach the mountaintop location. Abraham builds the altar, lays out the wood, binds his son like an animal for butchering, raises the knife to Isaac's throat. And suddenly Yahweh's messenger appears and calls to Abraham by name. The patriarch responds, and the messenger tells him he passed the test, and that he doesn't need to kill his son. Abraham looks up and sees, more sight motif, a ram caught by his horns in a shrub. This is all pretty famous, but there's something at this point in the story that's worth paying close attention to. So from here, I'll read the rest of the story straight from the good book. Quote, "So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Yahweh Yireh, whence the present saying, on the mount of Yahweh there is vision." Even more sight motif, but let's continue. "The messenger of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and said, 'By myself I swear,' Yahweh declares, Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will bestow my blessing upon you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the people of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. There's something odd in that last passage. Did you catch it? Abraham is said to have burned the ram in place of his son, but then Isaac is not referred to in the present tense again. Isaac is not mentioned as being unbound. The messenger instead says that because he didn't withhold his son, he's going to be made into the ancestor of many, but the ram isn't mentioned. And even wilder, when Abraham descends from the mountain, Isaac is not mentioned. In the narration throughout the story, the characters who are present are always referred to specifically at every other point in the journey. But when Abraham descends the mountain to his servants, he seemingly does it alone. Isaac's not there. He disappears from the narrative entirely for the rest of the chapter, all of the next one, and he only reappears in chapter 24. There's a tantalizing idea, argued by some scholars, that an earlier version of the folktale was a straightforward story about a different kind of faithfulness coming from Abraham, one where he was willing and actually did kill his own son. Of course, in this hypothetical version, Isaac would not be that son because Isaac has older stories, some of which may have been repurposed by the Abraham narrative. Presumably, if this is true, the sacrificed son's name has been lost to us. On top of the difficulty of Isaac, having more stories in Genesis, it's also notable that the story is a much better narrative with the suspense of waiting for Yahweh to provide the ram, and it fits better as an etiology for the place name, Yahweh Yireh, and so it might just be a touch too speculative to say it's the most probable background for this tale. If it was, it's been significantly modified. But considering some of the child sacrifices that do happen in the Bible, however, some of which are even celebrated, it is not beyond the realm of possibility or plausibility that Isaac was originally killed in the tale of his binding. Before this episode is over, I guarantee that you will find the idea of Isaac being sacrificed to be far less speculative, or your money back. But there's something else to the way the story is structured. It may not be a coincidence that Isaac's story in Genesis proceeds from his circumcision to the averted child sacrifice ritual. Circumcision was a common practice throughout the Middle East among various peoples at various times. Some, like Egypt and other parts of Africa, predating Israelite and Judahite identity by centuries or millennia. But it became a cultural practice and an identity marker among Yahwists that took root and became a key differentiator between Judahites and their neighbors, an identity marker that spurred tales of famous figures establishing the practice. And listeners who started at the beginning of the Bible Lore podcast will know that the story of Abraham's circumcision is not even the only origin tale for the practice provided in the Bible. In Exodus, you'll recall, there's the curious tale of Moses returning to Egypt from his time in northwest Arabia, where he picked up a family before heading back west to free his people from enslavement. As he's heading west, Yahweh gives Moses his mission. He must tell Pharaoh to free Yahweh's people and allow them to worship in the wilderness, but Yahweh will make it so that Pharaoh won't relent, and then, quote, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son. I have said to you, let my son go, that he may worship me, yet you refuse to let him go. Now I will slay your firstborn son." So we have a slaughter of firstborns being planned by Yahweh. Immediately after this, something happens. There's a lot of pronoun confusion, so let's read the text as we have it before we unpack what it might actually say. Quote from Exodus 4. "And it was on the way, at a place where they spent the night, Yahweh encountered him, and he sought to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his legs with it, and said, 'Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me.' So he left him alone. It was then she said, 'A bridegroom of blood by circumcision.'" So Yahweh shows up. Someone threatens to kill someone else, resulting in mass pronoun confusion. Is it Yahweh who seeks to kill Moses? Or seeks to kill their son? Or is Moses the one seeking to kill someone else? But anyway, Zipporah circumcises their son's penis with a flint and touches the bloody foreskin to someone else's legs, what's pretty obviously a euphemism for genitals. Feet or legs often just means genitals. We already discussed Zipporah's place as the first and only female mohel in Jewish tradition back in episode 5 with Susan Ackerman, a rare woman in a priestly role. But now let's talk a bit more about what's going on in the passage with all its pronoun confusion, offer a potential reconstruction of what those he's and hims refer to, and talk about the function of the story. In Stavrakopoulou's view, building on past scholarly arguments, there's a close tie between Yahweh announcing his intention to kill Pharaoh's firstborn son, this puzzling passage that mentions a blood magic circumcision ritual, and the eventual use of lamb's blood to protect Hebrew homes from Yahweh's executioner in the Passover story, as he does make good on his promise to slaughter Pharaoh's firstborn son. With this in mind, let's go back to our pronoun problem. Robert Hall proposed this reconstruction, and it came to pass on the way at the overnight lodging that Yahweh encountered Moses, and Moses sought to kill the child. And Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' genitals with it, and said, "Truly you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So Yahweh withdrew from Moses. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood by circumcision." The implication here being that Moses, seeing Yahweh, knows that his God is owed his son, like Pharaoh's firstborn son, who will soon die. Yahweh makes a claim over the first of everything humans and animals produce, your crops, your animals, and your children. And so Moses, like Abraham, moves to honor his God by sacrificing his son. But Zipporah, thinking quickly, realizes that she can circumcise her son instead, offering up some of his blood and flesh as a gesture of good faith and dedication to Yahweh, and touching Moses so that he is protected, much like the Hebrews during the Passover story, avoid Yahweh's wrath through blood substitution. The only minor quibble I have with this reading, which Stavrakopoulou supports, is that in the Passover story, it is Yahweh, or in what seems to be an edit, his messenger of death, who seeks to kill all who don't bear the mark. So maybe it's Moses who briefly attempts to kill the child in a desperate sacrifice, but it seems more likely to me that it's Yahweh. I mean, Yahweh did try to kill Balaam on his talking donkey that one time. And of course, she's a scholar. I don't read the languages. I'm just some asshole. So either way, much like the ram caught in the bushes in Isaac's story, a substitution is rapidly found, but this time Yahweh's hunger is not sated. One measly foreskin and a promise of enduring loyalty is not much of a meal. So after Moses returns to Egypt and Pharaoh repeatedly refuses to allow the Hebrews to leave, all the plagues, all that good stuff, Yahweh makes good on his promise to have his fill. Yahweh puts his intentions this way, quote from Exodus 11. "Thus says Yahweh, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." The Israelites, reenacting Zipporah's protective substitution ritual, put lamb's blood on their doorposts, protecting them from Yahweh's claim over their firstborn children. And it is Yahweh, apparently, and not his executioner, who does the final killing, quote from Exodus 12. "In the middle of the night Yahweh struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night, with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead." Like the most vicious take on Santa Claus, Yahweh goes from house to house and kills every single firstborn child and animal, from slaves and prisoners all the way up to Pharaoh himself, leaving alone the houses covered by blood magic. Yahweh gets his fill. From there, the narrative progresses through the journey out of Egypt until we get to the law codes, which pepper the rest of the Torah. Some of these law codes are likely older than the narrative portions, and the various codes seem to rewrite or overturn or expand on older codes. You'll remember from our very first episode that portions of the Bible, such as Exodus 20 through 23, rewrite and expand on laws found elsewhere in ancient West Asia, with these Exodus chapters finding pretty direct parallels in slavery and ox-goring laws from Hammurabi. The biblical codes did the same thing to each other, revising and iterating older works. This section, spanning from roughly Exodus 20 through 23, is called the Covenant Code. It starts with what's probably a later prologue, the most famous version of the 3 different sets of 10 commandments in the Bible. From there, it proceeds through its own version of Hammurabi's ox-goring and slavery laws, along with some other standard if X then Y casuistic laws like this one, quote, "When a fire is started and spreads to thorns so that stacked, standing, or growing grain is consumed, he who started the fire must make restitution." Stuff like that and a variety of ritual prohibitions. And then we get to the kicker. Quote from Exodus 22, "You shall not revile God, nor put a curse upon a chieftain among your people. You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the firstborn among your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me." End quote. The firstborn son is mentioned alongside the first yield of oil and wine and cattle and flocks. On the 8th day, the day of circumcision, all are to be brought to Yahweh and sacrificed. No distinction is made between the human infants and the crops, and no mention of circumcision or any other substitute is made for the human child. There is no ram of substitution. There are a couple of similar versions of these laws, though, and I've linked a short article from past guest Eve Feinstein in the Bibliography where she goes over many of these changes in detail, which I recommend checking out. The most similar and closest in distance is in Exodus 34. This time there's a curious addition, though, quote, "Every first issue of the womb is mine. From all your livestock that drop a male as firstling, whether cattle or sheep. But the firstling of an ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. And you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. None shall appear before me empty-handed." And there it is, the author fixes the alleged problem. Abraham's ram has been provided. And there are further explanations in later writings that state the nature of this redemption. Allegedly, the firstborn sons are to be dedicated to the temple service in some kind of priestly or otherwise cultic role. But Hayden, you object, wouldn't it be impractical to sacrifice every firstborn child? Now, that's true, but so would giving every firstborn son to temple service. This is a sort of propagandistic ideal, as we've discussed many times before on this show. These are not laws. Because even if some of these law codes, as they're called, were in circulation at an earlier pre-exilic date, sometime around our present 7th century moment, that does not mean they were widely known, let alone followed. With how steeped in 7th century concerns they are, it's extremely likely that parts of these texts took shape in this century, and child sacrifice as a popular 600s practice adds to this likelihood, no matter whether you think Exodus 22 commands it or not. It's a concern very rooted in its specific time period. But the fact that nobody tried to enforce any of these laws, as far as we can see, until the Hasmonean period, nearly 500 years after Manasseh's reign, makes it seem unlikely that they were widespread at all, despite how distinctly 7th century they are. What this means is that neither proposition is unlikely at face value, that the author of Exodus 22 meant child sacrifice or temple dedication, though obviously one is explicitly mentioned and the other one, temple service, has to be implied. Certainly devoting sons, firstborn or otherwise, to the temple was done sometimes. Where else would the temple get staff? But every single firstborn son? No economy could handle that many people cut off from all other labor. Even when the laws were enforced in the later period, this was not practiced to the letter of the law. There were substitutions made for this substitution. But that goes for child sacrifice too. Even if this was idealized and child sacrifice was considered proper cultic behavior by the people who wrote it, it's extremely unlikely that it was something every family would ever do, even if it had popularity in some circles. It would have been absurd and completely impractical for an entire group of people to actually do this as a universal practice, no matter how it's done. And in fact, when we get to talking about the actual practice of child sacrifice, the literal material of infant bones found buried in the dirt, what we will also find is animals substituted for them at times, like in Abraham and Isaac's story. So again, we run into a limit for how much we can truly glean from these so-called legal texts. They are propaganda of one kind or another. But the point to emphasize is that it's not at all implausible that a command for child sacrifice sits behind the propaganda. And frankly, I've been leading you on a little bit, saving some of the best evidence for last, because there's one prophet, at least, who believes that Yahweh, indeed, would and did give such a law, that he would command his people to sacrifice their own children. It's our friend from before, the prophet who was upset by women weeping for Tammuz in the Jerusalem temple, Ezekiel, one of the most fucked up guys in the entire Bible. Much of the book that bears his name is a discussion of why he believed that Judah had been cast into exile. We'll get into it more next time, but suffice to say for now that he believed it was the collective guilt and related individual choices of the Judahites that led to their destruction. In building his argument, Ezekiel responds to a retort to ask whether Yahweh spared innocent people from the destruction. And Ezekiel gives his perspective, or rather, Yahweh speaks through Ezekiel to give his perspective. Quote from Ezekiel 14. "The word of Yahweh came to me, 'Mortal, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and cut off its supply of bread and send famine upon it and cut off from its humans and animals, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these three were in it, they would save only their own lives by their righteousness, says Yahweh God.'" And that was not a mispronunciation there. It's not Daniel, the later prophetic figure who's being referenced here. It's Daniel, a figure who is, outside of this passage, never again mentioned in the Bible. He is, however, an important character in a story I mentioned earlier, the Akkad epic, one of the stories of death and famine followed by renewal. And so Ezekiel reaches far back into the legendary folklore, even to a figure who is otherwise unknown to the biblical authors, to discuss how furious Yahweh is with the Judahites. Even if the greatest individuals of all time had been in Judah, they alone would be spared. Everyone else would be damned to death and deportation and suffering and famine. None escape Yahweh's justice. There is no view of afterlife judgment, of heaven and hell. Everyone's fate is what they've earned on earth. Only the remnant remains for hope of the renewal of Yahweh's people. But Ezekiel's book contains other perspectives from the prophet, including one of the most heterodox views of the law, the Torah, in the entire Bible. And it's found in one of his several somewhat clashing views on child sacrifice. This bizarre passage occurs in chapter 20, where Yahweh, speaking again through the prophet, recounts the story of the Exodus. This version of the Exodus is Ezekiel's own take on it, and he says that even in Egypt, the people were worshiping the Egyptian gods, something Robert Alter notes is not anywhere found in the Torah. But Ezekiel, as he is wont to do, blends his metaphor with his own screeching rants against his contemporary audience. He constantly bashes you over the head in the middle of these stories with reminders that he's talking to you, his reader in the 6th century, and it can make these things a little confusing to read. Anyway, Ezekiel goes on, saying that as Moses led these terrible Hebrews out of Egypt, they received laws but disobeyed them, with Yahweh becoming more and more furious but refusing to fully destroy them. That mostly tracks with the story of the Exodus and the Torah. But then there's a fascinating twist. Quote, "I on my part raised my hand to them in the wilderness to disperse them among the nations, and to scatter them in the lands, inasmuch as they did not do my laws, and they spurned my statutes, and they profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes went after the foul things of their fathers. And I on my part gave them statutes that were not good, and laws through which they would not live." So there's something you won't find anywhere else in the Bible. The idea that Yahweh himself gave the Israelites bad laws. But let's see what Ezekiel say those laws were. Quote, "And I defiled them with their gifts when they passed every womb breach in sacrifice, so that I might desolate them, so they might know that I am Yahweh." Despite his earlier insistence that Yahweh punishes only the individuals and the collective for their guilt, here he puts in Yahweh's mouth the insistence that child sacrifice was itself part of some of these laws, meant to make them suffer even more by tricking them into doing more evil, asking them to slaughter their own children. And while his view is itself distorted and gives Yahweh a pretty bad rap, child sacrifice was indeed a native practice that may have found its way into some early laws and several early traditions, like the command for firstborn sacrifice that seems to be explicit in Exodus 22. The question, of course, is whether That Exodus passage is one of the very laws that Ezekiel is referring to in his laws that were not good and laws through which they would not live. It's circumstantial evidence, but it's compelling that Ezekiel says there's a law that commands child sacrifice, and, well, we see a law that commands exactly that. Ezekiel seems to think that this law was a worsening of other better laws, and some have even proposed that it's a difference in Ezekiel's opinions on the different law codes themselves, maybe before they were stitched together into the Torah as we have it. The reality, of course, is that whether a command to sacrifice firstborn children was intended by the author or not, the Exodus 2 command to give over your firstborn sons, along with all other produce, is probably the older law, the one that needed fixing by a later writer. You usually don't go from laws that say never to practice child sacrifice repeatedly to a single, barely noticeable law that includes it among many other ritual prescriptions. Of course, it's all still hypothetical, and whether Yahweh was responsible for that command, like Ezekiel says he was, is beyond the scope of this show. And regardless of its potential connection to Exodus 22, Ezekiel's view was a lot less attractive as a way of explaining child sacrifice, and so it apparently did not win many fans. Ezekiel's contemporary, Jeremiah, provided an explanation for the exile and child sacrifice that was a lot easier to swallow. Quote from Jeremiah 19. "Because the people have forsaken me and have profaned this place by making offerings in it to other gods, whom neither they nor their ancestors nor the kings of Judah have known, and because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent and gone on building the high places of Baal, to burn their children in fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or decree, nor did it enter my mind. Therefore the days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when this place shall no longer be called Tophet or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter." The mention of Baal here may be a bit of a scribal sleight of hand, because why would anyone assume Yahweh asked his followers to give offerings to Baal? Baal's got his own guys. More to the point, though, something about the later writings repeatedly emphasizing that Yahweh would never command such a thing is very, methinks the lady doth protest too much. Certainly someone seems to have thought Yahweh commanded it, otherwise why repeat it so many times? Nevertheless, that strong prohibition of ritual infant slaughter and denial of its association with Yahweh would become the more accepted explanation for past events. Even so, and even through the many denials and rewrites that we'll see happening throughout the Bible to distance Yahweh from child sacrifice, there remains in the Bible a story about an annual cultic ritual that commemorated and mourned just such a child sacrifice by Yahwists, one that provides a key to understanding the place of child sacrifice in the Bible, in ancient Judah and Israel, and in the broader Middle East and Mediterranean. The origin story for this annual event is found in Judges 11. Judges is a book that is set after Moses and Joshua have led the Israelites on their conquest, but just before the establishment of the monarchy. It's one of the more fractured and odd books of the Hebrew Bible, made up of loosely connected stories of individual heroes. One of these heroes is a man called Jephthah, a military commander who finds himself conscripted to lead troops in a territorial dispute with the Ammonites, northeast of the Dead Sea in modern-day Jordan. Before going into battle, Jephthah makes what most call a rash decision, quote from Judges 11. "And Jephthah made the following vow to Yahweh: If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be Yahweh's and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering." Some scholars emphasize that it could refer to an animal as the first thing that comes out of the house, but there's no evidence that sending animals to greet returning military heroes was any kind of normal practice, and some of the language is notably used primarily for humans. Jephthah's men, strengthened by Yahweh's favor, are victorious. Let's continue. Quote, "So the Ammonites submitted to the Israelites. When Jephthah arrived at his home in Mitzpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him, with timbrel and dance. She was an only child. He had no other son or daughter. On seeing her, he rent his clothes and said, 'Alas, daughter, you have brought me low. You have become my troubler. For I have uttered a vow to Yahweh, and I cannot retract.'" Yes, he blames her for the oath he made. He blames his daughter, who doesn't even receive a name. It seems likely that Jephthah, in the mind of the author, assumed a slave or some other person of no renown would be the first to approach him. But the substitute king ritual shows that the best way to appease the gods is not to leave things to chance. Pick your own sacrifice. Continuing, "Father," she said, "you have uttered a vow to Yahweh. Do to me as you have vowed, seeing that Yahweh has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites." She further said to her father, "Let this be done for me. Let me be for 2 months, and I will go with my companions and lament upon the hills and there bewail my maidenhood." "Go," he replied. He let her go for 2 months, and she and her companions went and bewailed her maidenhood upon the hills. After 2 months' time, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. She had never known a man. Now, there are apologists who will claim that, like the rewrites in the law codes, Jephthah's daughter, never named, was instead committed to temple service. You'll find that explanation all over the internet, and that the grand tragedy is that their familial line would die out because she would remain a virgin for the rest of her life. Or perhaps the tragedy is that she wouldn't see her father and friends again. Or maybe it's just that she won't get laid. I mean, that is a tough route. But these explanations are quite the stretch. Jephthah said that he would give whomever or whatever came out as a burnt offering for Yahweh to consume, and then he fulfills the oath. Probably the author of Isaac's story forgot to mention him coming down the mountain. Probably. Maybe the author of Exodus 22 forgot to mention the redemption clause, or assumed the reader already knew about it. Maybe. This story, though, doesn't work if the daughter isn't killed. And there's one more bit at the end of the story, which makes her death and descent into Sheol by far the only plausible reading. Quote, "And it became a fixed practice in Israel that each year the daughters of Israel would go to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year." And this part is critical. Any commentary or video about Jephthah's daughter and her tale of human sacrifice will hopefully note a couple things. First, this story functions as an etiology for whatever festival or annual event this epilogue describes. It's like so many other stories we've talked about on this show and in this very episode. It's a folktale to explain some real cultural practice. And second, this is obviously a tale of human sacrifice, seemingly condoned or at least unremarked upon by Yahweh, even if it's portrayed as a tragic tale, one that provides a sort of grim fairy tale, dark narrative moral about making rash oaths. But there's something else there. The nature of the commemoration of the daughter's virginity, an annual event where young women go to weep in relation to fertility. Why, that seems remarkably similar to the women weeping for Tammuz that I talked about at the beginning of the episode, where it would be a sort of fecundity ritual for crop fertility and a folktale to explain the changing of the seasons. And the similarities here have not been lost on critical scholars. This may have been the original function of the story. It was not about any old commemoration. It was specifically an annual crop fertility ritual, like the women in the Jerusalem temple who Ezekiel says weep for Tammuz. Our unnamed hero is her own culture's Baal, or Dumuzi, or Persephone, whose mother Demeter weeps for her after she's been taken into Hades.
I hear such wicked rumors now and then about my daughter, lost to me, and what became of her. Kore, we called her then. Persephone is what she called herself, before she vanished utterly, leaving no trace.
Jephthah's daughter's sacrifice, a sacrifice that ends her own father's lineage, helps ensure the survival of the Israelites and their success against their neighbors, and she averts the wrath of a God who is easily angered by broken oaths and promises. But she draws on an even richer tradition of men and women, divine and mortal, who were made to live in death's pit so that the crops would grow. She, unlike Isaac, receives no last-minute ram for substitution. And unlike Moses' son, there's no circumcision available to keep her father's knife from her neck and her body from the fire. And unlike Persephone or Baal or Tammuz or Akkad, she doesn't even get a name, and whatever mourning was done in her honor is never mentioned again. If the commemoration existed, its existence and its purpose were forgotten or marginalized long before the biblical texts were compiled. Her substitution, much more in line with typical child sacrifice practices, would not become a culture-defining story like Isaac's. It's an also-ran in Bible stories, rarely achieving the fame of Isaac or Abraham or Moses or David. And when I say her practice was similar to real cultic practices, I mean the real child sacrifices that went on around the Mediterranean, hitting an apparent peak in popularity around the 8th and 7th centuries. The key element that parallels the true practice is Jephthah engaging in child sacrifice as a fulfillment of an oath to his God. As we'll see next time, child sacrifice was often done for exactly this reason. A person swore a vow to a god, promising their own son or daughter, and when the child was born, they would make good on their vow, like Jephthah did, writing words that meant in fulfillment of an oath on the very jar where their infant's charred remains were interred and buried. As we will see, many oaths were fulfilled. Today, we've discussed some famous biblical stories and laws about perhaps the most taboo of all practices. While later authors spend a telling amount of time arguing that Yahweh would never command such a thing, and other scribes have likely rewritten portions of the Hebrew Bible to obscure some positive mentions of child sacrifice, it couldn't be ignored or fully excised from the text. It was such a horrific and embarrassing, but also apparently unremarkable part of cult, as tied into fertility and crop rituals as anywhere else in the Mediterranean, especially through Jephthah's daughter and her virginity commemoration. And we saw the parallels between the story of Zipporah and Moses' circumcision fiasco and the mass slaughter of the Egyptian firstborns, who were never made aware of the ritual substitute. Jeremiah and many other commentators insisted this was not their God's command, at least for the Israelites, and yet Ezekiel offered a different, far more chilling alternative. Yahweh was angered by the Israelites' faithlessness and wanted to punish them by demanding that they do something even more wretched and terrible. And Ezekiel, incensed by the practice of child sacrifice and the weeping for Tammuz in the Jerusalem temple, nevertheless still venerated the hero of a similar tale, Daniel, father of Akkad. But what we didn't get to talk about today, what we'll hit on in the next part of this mini-series, is the reality beneath the idealization, the actual sacrifices that these authors were grappling and reckoning with. Because there's a whole lot more to the real story of child sacrifice in ancient Israel. In response to the stark fact that people sacrifice their sons and daughters to Yahweh, there will be a foreign people and foreign gods blamed for this local shame: Manasseh, Baal, Moloch. All this and more on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast. Make sure to support the show by becoming a subscriber at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast.